Hey, good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by the Spanish-Singaporean Chamber of Commerce in collaboration with two companies, members of our Chamber of Commerce, the company FIDINAM and the company CRYSTAL CLEAR. And as you know, the webinar will be about the 2022 annual Singapore budget. My name is Fernando Rovira. I am the director of the Spanish-Singaporean Chamber of Commerce, and today I will be the moderator of this webinar. Let me just give you a few quick information about our Chamber of Commerce. We were established here in Singapore just 2 years ago. We are an official Chamber of Commerce, which means that we are recognized officially by the Ministry of Industry and Trade in Spain. We are part of the network of Eurocham, Singapore. We are also part of the network of official chambers of commerce worldwide. We are more than 50 chambers of commerce all over the world. And our role as a Chamber of Commerce is to promote a business relationship between Spain, Singapore, also to facilitate the business to our members and to help any company interested to do business with Spain or Singapore. Regarding today's webinar, as you know, last Friday, the Finance Minister, Mr. Wong, delivered the 2022 annual budget to the Parliament. And as always here in Singapore, the annual budget has a direct impact in the lives of Singaporeans and in the life of everybody living in Singapore. And of course, it has also a direct impact in all the companies based here in Singapore. So we think it's very important for all of us to understand very clear all the main issues, the main terms of the budget. And that's why we have here today these two important companies in Singapore that they are going to underline, they are going to explain us the main issues of the annual budget. First of all, we have the company FIDINAM. FIDINAM is a consultant firm that offers corporate administrative and tax advisory services to clients looking to invest in Asia-Pacific region. And the second company that will be participate as a speaker is CRYSTAL CLEAR, who is a corporate advisory firm specialized in incorporation, accounting and tax, human resources administration, and business and expansion. Before we start, let me give you a couple of practical issues about the webinar. First of all is that, as I said, there are two speakers at the end of both presentations. We will have time for a Q&A. So I encourage you to send us the questions you want by chat. And also to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and we are going to publish later in the YouTube account of the Chamber of Commerce. So without further delay, we're going to start with the first presentation. And the first speaker is going to be Olivier Tu, the CEO of CRYSTAL CLEAR. Olivier is a former corporate lawyer with more than 15 years of experience in assisting clients with international expansion and structuring in Europe and Southeast Asia. So thank you very much, Olivier, for your participation. And please, you can start and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you to the Spanish Chamber for organizing this event. First of all, I'll just introduce the two parts we will be talking about today. I will be covering the highlights and a general overview of the Singapore 2022 budget. And Tommaso from FIDINAM will be then following up with a more detailed presentation on relevant tax and employment policies that have been announced in the budget. And finally, we will finish with a question and answer session, hopefully to be able to answer any questions the audience may have. So I will be starting with presenting on the highlights and a general overview. So this is my quick profile. Just a very quick comparison between the headlines in the budget. So when the minister in Singapore, it's quite customary for the finance minister to do a long speech on the budget, and it's typically divided in different headlines. In 2021, the theme of the budget was emerging stronger together, emerging from what? Well, from the COVID pandemic. If for everybody that has noticed that. And the first theme was the relief for recovery. What we know about the 21 budget and the 2020 even more was a lot of the budget was focused on tackling the COVID-19 situation. It was trying to provide relief to businesses and families, and particularly the industries that were suffering from the pandemic, and emerging stronger from that. If you followed the transition between 2020, where the government had earmarked over 50 billion for COVID relief, it went into around 11 billion in 2021. And what we will see is in 2022, the relief for COVID is actually getting lower and lower as we start seeing an exit from the situation. So the big theme for this year's budget is charting our new way forward together. What does that mean? There are also other themes which are strengthened surrounding the green transition of Singapore into a more green economy, more sustainable economy, and also more efforts surrounding the population, healthcare, social needs of certain categories of the population. Nothing too surprising. In Singapore, there are not really many big surprises every year in the budget. Typically, announcements are made 3 years before they are implemented. And we will see that in concreto here with a number of measures that will become and see their day in the coming years. But what is striking in this, in the comparison with the 2 years, so we do see less of a focus on the COVID pandemic, more focus on something Singapore cares a lot about, which is investing in new capabilities, the digital transition. Interestingly enough, the green transition has moved from point D, the sustainable home for all, to point C, so a little more importance put on that, and of course, strengthening the social compact. What we've seen also in this year is a theme which is build a fairer and more resilient tax system. So there will be some small changes in the tax system, a lot of tax announcements, and of course, Tommaso will be talking more in detail about how this actually affects business or not. So what was the 2021 budget impact on the Singapore economy? The previous budgets focused on emerging from the COVID-19 crisis. In 2020, around 100 billion was earmarked to help coming out of the crisis. It went down to around 11 billion Singapore dollars in 2021. And then we'll see that in 2022, it's even gone further down to around just a billion. They now have numbers on the deficit for the actual budget year, which starts in the 1st of April of each year and finishes on the 31st of March of each year. And they're predicting it to be a 5 billion deficit for 2021 instead of the planned deficit of 11 billion. In 2020, they've realized as well that the planned deficit was lower than what they had initially earmarked. So Singapore has been doing quite well in planning for more expenditure, a bigger deficit than what eventually was realized. Unemployment rate has been down to 3.2%, which is not surprising because the government has been funding a lot of and putting a lot of subsidies to help employment. On the other hand, because of that and because of the amount of money that has been injected in the economy by the government, we've seen inflation and the rise of the cost of living in Singapore. You've probably all realized that in your supermarkets or rental prices have actually gone up quite a fair bit, more than the inflation rate that the central bank typically announces. So coming back to the focus in the 2022 budget, again, we're moving away from COVID support. There are still some support packages for household earmarked at 560 million Singapore dollars, for jobs and businesses in limited industries this time. limited to F&B, hospitality, tourism, and retail for around 500 million. And finally, something which is close to the target of Singapore, investing in training and improvement of digital skills for workers. And that's amounts to around 200 million. There's of course a continuation of the broad themes outlined in previous budgets. The emphasis is on building new capabilities, transitioning the workforce into the new digital era, transitioning into an environment and sustainable green economy, and of course enhancements and strengthening of the tax system, specifically around some consumer taxes and other taxes that were announced in the budget. It is somewhat of a balanced budget this year, and the four biggest accounts of expenditures will be healthcare in the first position for around 20% in 20 billion, then followed by defense, education, and transport. On the revenue side, the revenue comes in, it's budgeted to come in from net investments by the Singapore government, followed by corporate income tax, personal income tax, and GST. So the budget is somewhat balanced, just slightly higher on the revenue side. But what we would want to note is that there is the healthcare budget is still constantly increasing and more. And we'll come back to that a little later on how and why Singapore is putting a little more focus on that specific aspect of the economy. So the first point was investment in new capabilities. Singapore will continue to promote the tech industry and digitization, focusing more on these type of industries than maybe in the past, the financial services industry. There's a focus on local SMEs this time, encouraging innovation and R&D. Innovation and R&D was pushed for big MNCs previously, and the minister has announced that there's a much more of a focus on trying to get local SMEs to innovate, collaborate with local universities. And part of that is the continuation of the PSG grants, particularly in order to allow small and local businesses to digitize themselves. What is the impact on the actual workforce? Well, there is this big emphasis on reskilling mid-career workers, making sure that workers in their 40s and 50s will still be able to continue being part of the workforce in the next 10 to 20 years, and providing with the necessary change in their skill sets to continue being employed and productive. There's of course a link to that, a drive for digitization, productivity enhancement, instead of reliance on cheaper labor. So what we would see is the minister has been quite clear in announcing that they want to push companies to rethink about how they perform their services, be a little more productive and rely less on cheaper labor, and make sure that there's more automation and making sure that the employees they hire are higher up in the value chain. Interestingly enough, there's also been a push for the first time, I believe, in the budget about how to promote Singapore enterprises to be a little more global. And there's also been an announcement surrounding what they call the Global Executive Program, pushing Singaporean executives to go and explore globally and becoming more leaders worldwide. Finally, there's continued adjustments on foreign worker policies, and Tommaso will cover a little more about that, and we can have a little more details on what this really means for businesses locally. The second theme I've touched about earlier in the budget is the green economy. So it's a higher spot now on the agenda. Singapore is still on track and wants to target carbon neutrality in the second half of the century. I think this is a very modest target, but still they're committed to it, and they have established a green plan to follow the current global ESG trend that we can see globally pushed by Europe particularly. It aims to become also the go-to place in Southeast Asia for carbon services expertise. I believe Singapore has identified that there's, again, an opportunity to seize here, already being a good financial center to also tap into the carbon credit market, something that is coming up more trendily nowadays. And currently Singapore accounts for over 50% of the Asian green bond market and has earmarked up to 35 billion in green bonds to be issued by 2030 to fund public sector projects in the green and environment sector. There's also a commitment again to push for cleaner vehicles and electronic vehicles adoption, as well as a commitment to phase out combustion engines by 2040. As a matter of fact, Singapore now has reiterated that they are, I would say, vehicle neutral, so that they're not going to increase the number of combustion vehicles in the country year on year. The last somewhat big announcement is that the carbon tax will be raised by 5 times in 2024. Of course, currently it's still relatively low compared to the targets and what the recommendations are globally, but still they are planning to reach the $50 to $80 a ton of a carbon tax by 2030. So there's a commitment, and it will be in the typical Singaporean style. They will ease the increase year on year to finally reach that target. And as you can note, it's a range, so they're not committing to either being 80 or 50. When I believe I think globally the recommendation is around $100 per ton. So it's still modest in terms of what they implement, but at least they've got a plan and they've already made an announcement. So what does it mean in the terms of the longer term outlook? So there are 2 items in the budget, 2 headlines, which is surrounding the social compact and also about the taxation system and how they want to make it a little fairer. So as I mentioned earlier, the government healthcare expenditure is the biggest, and it actually has tripled between 2010 and 2019. They expect it to be the biggest increase in public spending still in the next few years, particularly because the Singapore population is aging. It's quickly becoming one of the oldest populations in the region, even probably maybe even in the world. And they realize that it will require new revenues to finance it, and a plan to restructure the current taxation and the current healthcare system. We've already seen some announcements surrounding the increase in the CPF contribution for workers over 55 years old, and because they notice that and they know that the retirement spending will increase as more and more Singaporeans will age and be of age to retire, the retirement bill will keep increasing on top of the healthcare bill. The government is still committed to continue to support lower wage workers. And finally, there are taxation changes. GST will increase. We knew that already for a number of years. It's just now it's been announced exactly what the rates and when it will increase effectively from next year. That's been talked by the minister and by the government about the wealth tax. I think there is an understanding that wealth needs to be taxed a little bit more in Singapore. And there's been some changes, including in the hard band of personal income tax, an increase in property taxes and luxury car taxes. But on the whole, not major changes that will really drive, I would say, wealth away from Singapore. Finally, there will be, there's announcements without real clear indication of how will it be implemented, but a commitment by Singapore to meet the OECD BEPS recommendations and not just the guidelines surrounding the minimum corporate income tax, effective corporate income tax of 15% that the OECD would like to be implemented worldwide for most countries. So Singapore knows and will be putting in place a plan and a structure to make sure that this minimum effective tax does not damage the revenues, the potential revenues, and the competitiveness of Singapore. So no clear announcement in so far as to what the measures will exactly be, but certainly there will be, they are working on that. I would like now to hand over to Tommaso that will cover the actual changes in the tax and employment policies. Tommaso, I will just stop the presentation here and just let you continue on the actual measures.
Yes, thank you very much, Oliver, and thank you very much, Fernando, again, for giving us the chance to present today. I hope everyone can see the screen and my slides now. Please let me know if that's not the case. So I will start briefly introducing FIDINAM, although Fernando already spent some work to introduce us. So I will just add on that we cover the entire Southeast Asia, including and in addition to China and Hong Kong, and we have several offices in the region. So today we are here to talk about Singapore, and I'm based in Singapore as part of the FIDINAM Singapore team, but we are able to assist our client for all the Southeast Asia and China and Hong Kong regions. Let me jump straight away into today's presentation. So in the next part of the presentation, I would want to cover a bit more in details the measures that the budget 2022 has introduced and the effect of these measures on the local businesses and the local workforce. So let's start from the enterprise disbursements. The enterprise disbursements, we have selected today 3 measures that we think are the most relevant for the local businesses. So from now on, I'm just going to be talking in details of these measures, what do they entail, and the impact on the local businesses. As you will see, all the schemes, the grants and incentives introduced by the budget, they have an impact on local businesses, and more specifically on how to help local businesses to employ local workforce or to co-fund the wage increase for the local employees. The first measure I'm going to talk about is the progressive wage credit scheme. The progressive wage credit scheme is a measure that has been introduced in the budget to co-fund the wage increase for eligible local employees for the next 5 years, from 2022 to 2026. What does this mean? It means that the government will help businesses to pay for the increase in the salary of the local employees. There are some conditions, of course, to be met by the local businesses in order to be able to benefit from this scheme. First of all, this scheme is targeting local employees, and by local employees, we are referring to Singapore citizens and permanent residents. And we just mentioned this scheme helps to co-fund wage increase, which is the minimum wage increase that will be covered. It's actually $100 in each qualifying year. This is the minimum increase that the government will help to co-fund. Specifically for this scheme, the budget has identified 2 different types of workers. They are low-income workers, divided into 2 tiers. The first tier are the ones earning up to 2,500 Singapore dollars per month, and the second tier is the one earning between 2,500 and 3,000 Singapore dollars per month. I think this slide is particularly useful to understand what I'm talking about. So the government will help to co-fund the wage increase. In the percentage you see in the left side of the slide, for the first year, it's going to be co-funded at 50% for the first 2 years, and then the decreasing percentage until 15%, which means actually that the government, for every $100 of increase paid to the employee, will co-fund 50% of the salary itself. For the second year, the percentage are slightly lower, as you can see from the slide. So it's going to cover only 3 years compared to the full 5 years of the first year. When will the payout be received by the businesses here in Singapore? It will be received in the following year compared to when the increase is actually paid. So if the increase happens in 2022, the payout will be received in the first quarter of 2023, so on and so forth for the following 5 years. In classic Singapore style, there's no need for companies to apply to receive the co-funding from the government, but the payouts will be automatically credited via Giro or in addition to Pay Now Corporate. So the government will actually refer to the CPF contributions made for the local employees in order to select which one will benefit for this scheme. The next grant we have chosen to describe today is the Small Business Recovery Grant. This is an extremely straightforward grant that will cover small and medium enterprise. This is very important for local businesses and small and medium enterprises. What's the definition of small and medium enterprise given by the Ministry of Finance? Those companies with an annual operating revenue less than 100 million Singapore dollars or 200 or below 200 employees in 2021. This grant specifically targets the companies in the sectors that have been affected by the COVID-19 restrictions. So the 4 sectors that have been chosen are the food and beverage, retail, tourism, and hospitality. If you want to know whether your company qualifies for the grant, you may refer to the activity code as per the Company Registry Act here in Singapore, because IRAS has actually prepared a table where you can cross-check whether your company qualifies for this grant. The company, to be eligible, of course, needs to be a live company with a physical presence in Singapore, registered before 31st December 2021, which is the grant that will be effectively given to the companies in Singapore. Well, eligible firms will receive $1,000 per local employee, capped to $10,000 per every company. Again, there will no need to apply to receive the grant. The government will automatically disperse the grant. It's not yet clear when this will happen. The speaker has mentioned that they will notify eligible business starting from June 2022, and compared to similarly actually to the other grants, also the small business recovery grant will be exempt from income tax for the employers that will receive them. Finally, the last scheme is the Jobs Growth Incentive Scheme. This incentive actually has been introduced already in the previous budgets, and it was first introduced to help businesses to mitigate the COVID effect and the slowdown of the economy in Singapore. And it's already entering the 3rd phase. Specifically in this budget, they have extended the incentive for additional 6 months. And what is the goal specifically of this incentive? The goal is to help businesses to increase their local workforce, and specifically to increase the local workforce earning more than 1,400 Singapore dollars per month. So again, in the grand scheme of the budget is another measure helping the local workforce and local residents, Singapore citizens or permanent residents, to be hired by businesses. Specifically, the 3rd phase of the Jobs Growth Incentive will help to pay the salary of new hire, both non-mature and mature. And this actually is a link to what Oliver was saying, that the government is very much carefully taking care of mature workers in Singapore above 40 years old. We have prepared a quick example to make it easy to understand. The baseline for this scheme is September 2021. So the government will compare the workforce in September 2021 and the increase happening in the following 6 months, so from October to March 2021. If, like in this case, the employer decides to hire additional staff, moving from 9 to 11 local employees that meets the minimum salary, in this case, and assuming the employer continues to meet the criteria every month, in this case, the company will receive 15% of the first $5,000 paid to the non-mature new hire for 6 months, and 50% on the first $6,000 paid to the local employee above 40 years old for 12 months. So there's an additional coverage to help businesses to hire mature employees. The payouts from the government actually for the phase 3, this one, will start in March 2022, and there are going to be 6 payouts until June 2023. Yes, moving on, we are gonna deep dive into the tax changes introduced by the budget. As Olivier said, there's been a few important updates discovered from this budget actually. and outlined in the budget. We are gonna specifically talk about the increase in the personal income tax rate in Singapore, the increase in the GST, and we actually thought it was important to include the fact that Singapore is actually considering to introduce a minimum effective tax rate for multinational corporations in Singapore to meet the minimum tax rate of 15% as promoted by the OECD. As also Olivier said, the speaker in the budget mentioned that they're studying the introduction of this measure. It's not yet clear when it's going to happen, how is it going to happen, and what's going to be the impact on the businesses. But it's definitely big news that they're already considering the introduction of the minimum effective tax rate. Well, with reference to the personal income tax, the news is that there's going to be 2 new brackets for a high earner worker in Singapore resident. The impact will only be for the Singapore workers earning more than $500,000 Singapore dollar per year. So there are additional new 2 tax brackets with tax rate of 23 and 24%. Previously, people in these brackets were actually taxed at 22%. So from 0 to 22%, there's no changes. For people earning less than 3,200 Singapore dollar per year, there's no change in the tax payable at the end of the year. The new brackets only affect the high earner above $500,000 Singapore dollar per year. What the budget has mentioned is that only 1.2% of the taxpayer will be affected by this measure. So it's a very marginal percentage. And they expect to raise additional 170 million of additional tax revenue per every year, thanks to this new measure. There's been also an increase in wealth taxes, specifically for property tax rate, both for actually non-residential, non-occupied, owner properties and actually owner-occupied properties. So for both categories, the tax rate has gone up, as well as for the luxury car. So the discussion around the wealth tax is actually already present in the budget. There's been some new introduction, and for sure we're going to see more discussion around wealth taxes in the coming budgets. With reference to the GST rate, actually the GST rate was already first mentioned in 2018, then in 2020, if you remember, has been postponed due to COVID reasons, of course, and finally in this budget it's been made official, although it's been staggered into 2 different phases. So the GST rate will go up from 7 to 8% starting from 1st of January 2023, and it's going to go up from 8 to 9% from 1st of January 2024. To balance out the increase in the GST, actually the budget already indicated that there's going to be some payouts to Singaporeans to reduce the effect of the increase of the GST on the final consumers. Specifically, there's going to be GST voucher for senior citizens, cash payouts for adults Singaporeans, as well as rebates for HDB households. It's important to mention for businesses that I think we have included in this slide the quick checklist for the GST preparation when the rate will change. I think it's specifically important to make sure to review the contracts and the agreements for the GST rate when this is charged or borne by both parties. So this is an important point to carry out for businesses before the implementation of the new GST rate. I won't talk too much into details about this slide. It's actually just to mention that there are transitional rules already prepared and included in GST rate that applies for those transactions that span the GST rate change are covered. In case you have any specific queries, then we are happy to take them at the end of the presentation. My last section today is going to be on the foreign workforce policies. I'm sure you've heard already of the new changes. It's been a hot topic in Singapore, and actually for the employment passes, there's a change in the minimum qualifying salary that has been raised from $4,500 to $5,000. And for the financial services sector, that has always been considered a separate sector by the MOM and the Minister of Finance, the minimum qualifying salary has increased to $5,500. When the changes will take place for the new application from the 1st of September 2022. For renewals, 1st of September 2023. The budget already actually indicated, as you can see in brackets in the table, that the candidate in mid-40s, the increases should be up to 10,500. Of course, this is a general indication. Every candidate, depending on their experience, their qualification, their educational certificates, they might be considered differently, and different salary may apply to be eligible for employment passes. So this is just a general indication given by the budget and the MOM to highlight that the qualifying salary is actually being raised. Same applies to the S-Pass. The change in minimum qualifying salary is also going up for the S-Passes with a slightly difference, which is the increase in the salary has been staggered into 3 different phases, starting 1st of September 2022 for new applications until the 1st of September 2025. From the current 2,500 minimum salary for S-Passes, we are going to go up to 3,300. And for the financial services sector, it's going to be raised up to 3,800. There's a specific focus from the MOM and the budget itself actually highlighted as well for mid-skilled workers, such as the one eligible for the S-Pass. The measures will be additionally tightened. In fact, there's also an increase in the levy payable by the employers for every S-Pass holders. It's going to be almost doubled from 330 currently to 650. And again, it's going to follow the same 3 phases as the minimum qualifying salary going up. And specifically for the construction and the process sectors, actually the dependency ratio ceiling will be reduced from 1 to 7 to 1 to 5. And this is just one additional measure highlighting how tightened the new measure will be. I think I'm going back to Oliver, as this was my last slide for the conclusion. And thank you very much again for the attention. Oliver, you wanna pick this up? I think you are on mute. Well, I guess while we wait for Oliver, I can just go on. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, thank you, Tommaso. So sorry, yeah, I was on mute. Yes, I think we just wanted to finish with a general conclusion on our thoughts on the budget and what that actually means for smaller businesses, SMEs here in Singapore. I think a big conclusion, and no major surprises in the budget as it is with Singapore. Everything is planned a little ahead, and the ease in measures. So there's not been any announcement that are extremely surprising. Singapore is still committed to remain attractive and a good place to do business. For businesses, no changes in the headline corporate income tax, still remaining at 17%, which is one of the most competitive in the region, and nor any real drastic changes in the taxation of wealth, despite of the announcements. Actually, the marginal increase by 1% doesn't really make a huge dent, I would say, in the incomes above $1 million. On top of that, the minister has said that they would not impose strictly speaking, a net wealth tax, because it's difficult to really assess how net wealth for individuals. So I think Singapore is still committed to bring wealth to Singapore to safeguard its financial services industry. On the other hand, the subsidies that have been given and the new consumer taxes, and namely the GST, have and will still continue to have an impact on the cost of living and inflation. We've already seen that. And although some of the subsidies and the grants sponsoring some of the local employment will disappear, it should result currently, at least still, from employees. As we know in Singapore, the job market and the employment rate is quite low, for employees to expect maybe higher salaries in this year. So we've already seen that on our side, that that there's been some kind of inflation in terms of salary expectations, just because unemployment is quite low and the cost of living is increasing. We'll have to see how the fact that the subsidies have stopped, how this will really impact the unemployment rate, whether the individuals and the staff that were hired under the grant schemes will stay on with the companies, because this will be additional cost to businesses. But currently, we can expect businesses to have a wage bill on the increase, which may be probably the bigger impact on businesses. So not a direct tax, but more on the expense side for employees. It will be harder, and it is currently harder to employ and import foreign talent. Although the minister, during his speech, has committed in one sentence to be a little more transparent. We'll have to wait what this really means in terms of the EP and the visa application process. Finally, quite a big part of the budget was focused on the ESG sector and R&D spending, productivity, digitization. So we believe that in these sectors, at least, it will be easier for businesses wanting to come and implement Singapore operating in these sectors, as opposed to maybe some other more traditional sectors. And finally, of course, as there's been a commitment to helping still easing out of the pandemic to F&B, retail, tourism, these businesses will still benefit potentially for a longer period from some of the support packages the government has announced. So generally speaking, this is an outline, very brief conclusions on what we believe the budget will have an impact on businesses locally. And of course, we're going to end here, but we'll welcome any questions you may have on what we've talked about, or the budget, or even some topics maybe we haven't covered.
Okay, thank you very much, Olivier and Tommaso, for this very interesting presentation. You gave us a lot of information. And now we're going to start a time for the Q&A. I encourage all the attendees to send me the questions you are interested through the chat. And in the meantime, I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask you, both of you, and just to know your opinion about some of the topics you just talked. First of all, it will be, how attractive do you think is Singapore for foreign investment if we compare now with the Singapore we met 5 years ago? How attractive is still for foreigners to invest here compared with 4 or 5 years ago? I would like to know the opinion of both of you about that.
Tommaso, you want to, or otherwise
I think, okay, I'll go first. Well, I think a lot has changed compared to a few years back, pre-COVID Singapore. Although I think it's, and we cannot talk about how Singapore is competitive and attractive without talking about COVID and the response Singapore had with compared to COVID. And I think Singapore bounced back quite quickly compared to the neighbors country. And this budget, actually, since we're talking about the budget, it's already approved of how quickly it was able to come back almost to pre-pandemic level. Recently, actually, also Hong Kong issued the new budget, and the Hong Kong budget is fully focused still on the measures to fight the COVID pandemic. And it seems you are reading Singapore budget 2 years ago. So this is just to give you a comparison to the other big hub in the region. And Singapore cannot be taking a loan because it's really its competitiveness it's due to also its position and how it's integrated with the local, the neighbor countries and the other jurisdiction around Southeast Asia. So I think it maintains highly attractiveness compared to the local country, as it's still the destination for local investments, especially those investments looking to set up regional headquarters for the region, because again, the other big hub that used to be Hong Kong is not as competitive as it used to be for many reasons that we know. I think the great downside, I would say, at the moment is bringing in foreign talent and obtaining working visa, what Olivier has mentioned, and we have discussed a bit about the new measure on DP, because I think Singapore will try to rely less and less on foreign talent and try to find a better integration with the local workforce. And that's why many of the schemes we have described today actually are trying to support the local workforce. So that's what I would say. I don't know, Olivier, what do you want to add on this?
No, I think you've touched on most of the points, and it's very, very insightful to see exactly to reposition Singapore in comparison to other countries worldwide. So, of course, we being in Singapore, we see what we're happy with, what we are happy with. But yes, generally speaking, and I think I touched very briefly on it. In 2020, what they had planned in terms of expenditure was actually higher. You know, the packages they had put in place, it wasn't fully spent. Same thing for 2021. So that deficit and what they had planned in eating in their reserves was eventually lower. And now we're back to almost a balanced budget. So within a year and a half, they had already eased out almost the spending, I would say, on COVID. Of course, there's still a lot of spending there. But I think to come back to Fernando's point of comparing Singapore now and 5 years ago, of course, it's impossible to compare without looking at COVID. But I think there's somewhat of a shift in terms of the industry Singapore is focused on. Singapore is always thinking ahead about what is the industry of tomorrow. We're talking about, and in Singapore, we keep hearing it again and again. So we really, I would say, in an environment here, but it's about digitization, moving up into the value chain, getting more tech companies here. I think if you look at 5-10 years ago, if I remember well, there was a lot of focus on the financial sector, a lot of focus on banks and bringing a lot of that. But I think now there's somewhat of a diversification in terms of the industry here. There's funds here, so why not build a startup ecosystem? The minister mentioned unicorns again. And a system where the first 3 unicorns will yield founders that will come out, will have money, reinvest in startups and so on and so forth. So they're building, they're focusing a lot surrounding that, and also the skills of the people here, the workforce, to be able to work in these startup companies. And I think this is the commitment, and what Singapore would have been pretty attractive. We all somewhat know that if you are trying to get an EP for somebody in the tech industry, it's going to be much easier than if you're going to get somebody in one of the more traditional industries. And I think this is what we see nowadays. Singapore is planning ahead on, okay, what is the sector we want to? And I'll be quite curious to see, because they've made this announcement, brought up a little bit, and this is my take on things, on the environment, the carbon credits, I would say the green financing things, how they will be able to capture this market share. So, but yes, Tommaso, you're right. You can't really see that without the prism of yeah.
Okay, thank you, Tommaso, Olivier. One question about the GST. You mentioned that the GST is going to be increased. As we know, production cost for a lot of companies has been increased also recently. Inflation is increasing. Do you see that now the GST is going to be increased together with all this cost increasing, that can affect the domestic consumption here in Singapore, and therefore that can affect the company's profits?
Olivier, you go first this time.
You're the tax expert, Tommaso. Yeah, I think I've touched a little bit on this, and I think these consumer taxes obviously are although from a business standpoint it's somewhat neutral, but I think it's going to have an impact invariably overall. But that said, the GST rate is still one of the lowest even worldwide, right? So I don't think it's for foreign businesses to say, hold on, the GST is increasing from 7 to 8 and then to 9%. which is again easing it in, is going to have an impact on pricing that much, right? So I don't think businesses will have to decrease their pricing to compensate for the increase in GST. I think that typically GST makes it somewhat neutral. And because the rate is still lower than in most countries, I think Malaysia still has it slightly lower, and maybe other countries in the region are slightly lower. But I don't think this will have a massive impact. But I do think it will have an impact on, you know, just the cost of living, generally speaking, and that the end consumer will spend more, and that invariably they will expect more in terms of salaries and packages and so on and so forth. So I think Singapore's thinking about the fact that, well, if businesses invest in digitization, automation, moving their employees up the value chain, then these employees will deserve higher salaries. And maybe eliminating a part of the maybe it's not the right term, but making part of the workforce or jobs here in Singapore a little redundant, they will decrease the cost of how the businesses are run. And that's probably how they sponsor through the PSG schemes and all the training schemes, the money that's invested in changing the workforce, that they alleviate for that. But again, it's, you know, trickle effects, right? One-on-one. Difficult to predict whether this is going to be the case or not.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with Olivier, actually. I think, yeah, the impact of the GST on local businesses is not going to be a major impact, so to speak. And it's totally true that if you look at the GST, VAT rates, especially in the region, Singapore is still one of the lowest. So it's still a convenient tax framework to be operating in Singapore. And actually, to Olivier's point, it's very much correct. Singapore is looking ahead always in terms of targeting the right industries, attracting certain type of talents from abroad, and to mitigate the GST impact on the final consumer is specifically important for the low-income family. And Singapore and the government are always they pay a lot of attention to try to balance out this impact on the final consumer. There's already quite a few number of payouts, rebates, and grants given to the local low-income families to try to absorb the additional GST rate. And again, for businesses, it's very much what Olivier said. I don't want to add anything more, because targeting certain industry, salaries will go up. The foreign talents attractive is specifically targeting also to increase the knowledge and the capabilities in this sector. So I think that's gonna really make the GST impact, other than the fact it's been already staggered and postponed once already, not so major for local business.
Okay, thank you, both of you. We have a question here from Antonio. He's asking, what do you expect from the plan of having a top-up tax to reach the OECD minimum global of 15%?
Yes, well, I think we both mentioned this. The big news is actually it's already part of the discussion, and it wasn't present in the previous budget. So what the speaker actually described in the budget speech is that they are contemplating a top-up tax to bring the minimum effective tax rate to 15% in order to be able to align with the general tax policies around the globe as promoted by the OECD. I think it's very much not clear the timeline and specifically the implementation of the tax, but that's my humble take. I think it's gonna probably be defined more clearly in the next one or two budgets in the next couple of years. But I think also Singapore, to maintain the attractiveness, will try once again to, if that happens, to keep the environment for MNCs still very favorable. Maybe there's going to be grant on other sides, such as payroll, local employees, because most of the businesses, MNCs in Singapore, including all the tax incentives, probably they are facing a lower than 15% tax rate, so there's definitely going to be impacted. So I'm sure the government will support them in other ways, especially through the help of the government agencies such as EDB or Enterprise Singapore. They're always very proactive to make sure Singapore, for MNCs, still stays very attractive in the region.
Yeah, I agree. I think in typical Singapore fashion, if I may say, Singapore wants to obviously be committed to respecting the fight against, base erosion, profit shifting. One of the main agendas of the OECD in the last few years to make sure that taxation is imposed fairly where value is created. So they will be very quick to commit to these measures, but also in typical fashion will look exactly and find the best way to implement it without losing the competitiveness and the attractiveness and the appeal of setting up in Singapore, and particularly a favorable taxation system. So I think it's they won't rush to announce new measures and implement that without knowing what the consequences are. Instead, they will wait a little bit and see and try to adapt and make sure that it's compliant with the overall guidelines of the OECD, so that they are, of course, seen as compliant and meeting the standards required globally. But at the same time, making sure that the companies in Singapore will not live in droves or lose the attractiveness here. So I'm quite confident that it won't have a major impact. Also, this taxation is only for very big companies currently. I mean, it doesn't have an impact on that. I believe maybe this audience might be smaller companies, but Tommaso, it's more than 750 million.
Correct, consolidated, yes.
Yeah, consolidated worldwide, right? So not huge, but big enough, right, for big MNCs. Yeah. And I think anyway, Singapore will not go below that, so it will be definitely the highest threshold that we'll adopt. And yeah, I think they'll be very pragmatic about how they implement it. But that's only my take on things.
Okay, thank you. We are almost reaching the scheduled time to finish, but I would like to ask you one last question about foreign workers. As we all know, quite important number of foreigners are living in Singapore, and among other reasons, one of them might be that they feel that now there are less job opportunities for foreigners. So what do you think it will be the official policy, at least for the next 2 years, the official policy of the Singaporean government towards hiring foreigners here in Singapore, either in the sense of making hiring more complicated or making it easier? What do you think?
Maybe I'll just start on this one. I think it's the minister said they would they're planning to make it a little more transparent, and I think this is what we all are waiting for to a certain extent, to have a little more certainty as to, okay, is that something that will work or not work? So at least we have clarity before we start planning or we start hiring or growing. I think that they probably have a certain degree of clarity within the MOM, and within, they probably have a point system. There's been talks maybe of making it more available and more transparent in maybe publishing these systems, like in certain other countries where you've got a point system per the candidate or per the company. Hopefully this is what they will start making available. But I think it's they've got some sectors. They definitely got some sectors where it's easier, and other sectors where it's less less desirable, not part of their core activities that they want to promote growth in. So again, I would exercise caution. I'm hopefully, because I'm an optimistic, that they will indeed come up with a system which is a little more transparent. But who knows? I think this has probably been the biggest frustration for a lot of the businesses here, not knowing, and trying to be incrementally testing the system, and also in the way they respond, right? Whether the application is not welcome, or whether maybe we just tweak something and then the application will go through. Hopefully we will see that. But I'll be very cautious into, unlike some other subjects where I'm a little more bullish and confident about what the changes on the EVs and the workers, I'm quite skeptical. I don't know, Tommaso, what is your take on it?
No, I agree with you. It's difficult to predict, especially when it comes down to immigration policies in Singapore. I think there is a general direction, which in a nutshell is what you mentioned. There are certain sectors definitely where the government agencies want to attract talent from abroad, but it has to be highly skilled talent, top talent in certain industry that can bring a certain expertise, a certain knowledge that will help the sectors to grow, and it will help spreading this knowledge among the local workforce. That's definitely what they're targeting. In terms of mid-skilled or more traditional sectors, I don't think, but again, that's my take, there's going to be any significant changes in the next 1 or 2 years. I think the direction is pretty clear. Policy is quite tight. I guess the hope is exactly what you mentioned. Having a slightly more transparent for people outside the MOM to know what is the reasons why certain passes are rejected, or again, that will really help, especially SMEs, to plan ahead, especially for a regional office or a sales office in Singapore where you think you need to bring someone from abroad. That will definitely be something that we hope it's going to happen, but it's very difficult to predict.
Maybe I just want to add another word. When you mentioned this, it came to my mind. It's yeah, I mean, there's, for example, a visa that they have now implemented, which is the technology transfer visa, where you know, for a very short period of time they'll bring a foreigner, but only for a very short period of time, to transfer the knowledge here. So again, this is an indication that they're thinking, right, you know, we're not going to bring somebody here permanently. We just want that person to come here, give the technical support, and then, you know, bye-bye, go back, right? So, but on top of that, I think one thing in the speech that I noted was the idea when they were talking specifically about the S passes and how they increase the threshold. How and when you look at this in conjunction with the support for digitization and automation, Singapore realizes that again it wants to move up in the value chain, and I believe that they are okay, I believe, with even offshoring certain types of jobs. That the idea is not to bring foreign talent to meet some lower level, less value added jobs. They are probably wanting to make sure that enterprises, as much as possible, SMEs here, automate, digitize, instead of really relying on more workers brought in from abroad. Of course, that doesn't apply to the work passes in the construction and other sectors, but for other type of service industries or even in manufacturing, I think they will push companies and they'll support companies in their automation, digitization, transformation, instead of, you know, allowing them to bring more talent from abroad. And I think it's a little forward thinking insofar as they understand that Singapore is a high cost jurisdiction. And we've really seen that a number of enterprises here are thinking about offshoring and seeking, you know, the world is becoming a little more global in the sense of finding the best resources at the best competitive price internationally. So I think they understand that, and I don't think they're necessarily afraid of it. I think they will embrace it and put in place policies to make sure that at least for the local workforce, they're uplifted to meet the job requirements of tomorrow. We've heard that a number of times here in Singapore.
Okay, we already reached the time to finish the event, so I want to thank very much Tommaso, Olivier, for this very interesting presentation. I also want to thank all the attendees for joining us today. I hope to see you in the next online event of the Spanish-Singaporean Chamber of Commerce. And thank you very much. Best regards and goodbye, everybody.
Thank you very much, Fernando.
Yeah, thanks again, Fernando.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.